Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation. Today we're going to be looking at sources of heat load in polo and other equestrian sport. My name is Dr. Russ Best and I lead the Masters Programme, Polo Science and Environmental Ergogenic Research Groups at Wintec Centre for Sport Science and Human Performance. Really excited about today because I get to bring together two of my favourite research topics in equestrian activity and heat as well. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. Today we're going to look at different types of heat transfer, sources of heat load that an athlete and horse will experience when playing polo, and this extends to other equestrian activity too, and what we can do about it. And finally, I'll wrap up by saying, sharing with you a little bit about our research that we've got ongoing at the moment at Wintec and how we're looking to advance this field and our understanding in the area too. So I've adapted this diagram from Gisolfi and Wenger that was first published in 1984. So we've had this idea really for 40 years now. And there are a number of factors that might influence the heat load placed upon an athlete. These are all captured in this brilliant diagram here. And the most important ones really are the idea of mechanical work. So what we do, and you can see this here by work being a source of heat output there, occurring within contracting muscle. This will increase our core temperature as we exercise, and that's really what we get hot doing. So that's why we also sweat and why we increase our rate of respiration. And these are both valuable sources of evaporative heat loss. We also lose heat by something called convection, which is to do with air and water passing over the skin and being pulled into the atmosphere. We have changes in skin blood flow to account for this too, so moving more blood closer towards the surface, and you'll see this in horses as well. And that allows us to cool a greater blood volume to keep us cooler for longer. Now the problem with that is the air is also hot, and depending on the altitude we're at, the degree of protection we get from ozone might differ as well as the density of the air. We also have temperature and humidity, which we are more familiar with. So the hotter it is, obviously the hotter our core gets and the faster it gets hotter. Humidity decreases our ability to lose heat via these evaporative means because the air is already moist and full of water. And then finally, something that we don't think about a lot is solar radiation. So the heat emits infrared, which also serves to heat us up. And if you sat under a patio heater, you might have experienced this. So it's not hot in the same way as the air would be. It's a very different source of heat, a very different heat experience. And this gets reflected depending on the surface that we're exercising on. And also the ground is capable of storing a bit of heat and then releasing that over the course of the day. So if we think about different equestrian activities, it's not so bad for polo. We probably have to factor in solar radiation and angle of the sun for that. But for other equestrian disciplines such as dressage, where they're competing on a nice, light, bright surface, there's going to be a thermal load bouncing back a bit yet. And also factors such as clothing might interfere with this, protective gear, and then what you put on your horse as well. So we're not just thinking about you, we're thinking about your horse too, because you're in contact with that horse and you're also experiencing all the heat that that horse is producing. So a little bit more about that on the next slide. Here we've got a lovely equation. Now I'm just going to run you through this. So if we start at the left, we've got M, and that stands for metabolic rate. That's the energy and heat cost of being alive. And then we have work performed. So this is another source of heat for us. So M minus W is our metabolic work rate that we're trying to manage. On the other side, we've got these sources of heat dissipation. So anything you see with an H in front is a source of heat dissipation. Dry heat transfer, so H dry, is all those things we've talked about in the previous slides, such as conduction, convection, and radiant heat loss. We then have H evaporation, which is heat lost due to differences in pressure of liquid. So that's sweating and also lost through breathing a little bit as well. And then finally, we've got H respiration. So H resp is heat loss through respiration. And that's why we see an increase in ventilation over the course of exercise, and as we continue to increase exercise intensity, we'll move more air in and out to try and keep those lung tissues and our core temperature down. And finally, we've got S, which is the rate of heat storage. And that is really driven by the imbalance of these two sides of this equation. So my heating factors on the left of that equals sign, and then my heat losing or cooling factors on the right hand side. And what we're trying to do as we perform exercise, we're trying to really keep our core temperature as low as possible for as long as possible. Now, in equestrian sports, this is further complicated because we're sat on top of something which is also trying to do the same, and we're asking it to work incredibly hard in an incredibly precise manner. So you can see we've got a bit of difficulty here, and that really suggests that we should be looking to maybe intervene at some of these points. So whether that be the dry, the evaporative, or the respiratory, and also really modifying the M and the W. We can't do much about our metabolic rate, unfortunately, but we can think about how we work our horse and how we work ourselves. So in polo, we've got the luxury of playing multiple horses, and how you manage those horses will affect the horse's core temperature and therefore your core temperature. On the next slide, we're going to look at a couple of interventions that we can put in place, which will really focus on this H dry and H evaporative component, and therefore affect the heat storage and heat balance of you or your horse as well. We split this slide in half. On the left-hand side, you can see that we've got human strategies. On the right-hand side, we've got equine strategies. We'll start with these human strategies briefly. These are the most practical, they're not the most aggressive. So other evidence is out there, but the most practical for equestrian sports are the use of cooling vests, and you can also extend this to neck and head cooling. Really helps to bring the core and blood temperature down prior to exercise, so we have a lower core temperature when we start, and hopefully a slower increase in core temperature as we exercise. Similarly, we can also consume cold drinks or ice slushies before exercise and even during. And then finally, another area that I'm interested in is this idea of subjective cooling. So we might not actually be lowering your core temperature, we're just lowering your perception of how hot you are. And that's through the use of ingredients such as menthol, and using menthol alongside these other strategies too. On the equestrian side of things, or equine side of things, really simple. Keep your horse in the shade for as long as you can. That's not always possible, but try and get it back into shade post-exercise, particularly if you're playing a tournament, to just balance its heat out and minimize the heat exposure and that radiant heat load. If we think about timing now, if it's really hot, you're going to have to do less of a warm-up because that rate of core temperature will increase faster. And the rate at which the core temperature will increase faster. So you might want to incorporate some breaks in the warm-up activity you're doing. Or if we think about playing polo, it might be from a horse welfare perspective that increase the time between chukkers and half time to allow horses to cool down and minimize really maximize that time between playing and playing again if they're playing multiple chukkers. Australia does this really well. And finally, probably the most contentious issue in this presentation is that of hosing after playing and after exercise. Keep that hose on your horse for as long as possible. And some fantastic work in this area by Dr. Dave Marlin, which has compared scraping or not scraping. Believe it or not, you want as much liquid on that horse for as long as possible to give that heat that the horse is producing somewhere to go. Water is better at storing heat than air is, so the wetter your horse can get and the longer that water is on that horse, the cooler that horse is going to be, and the cooler it's going to get more quickly. I'll link to some data and further comment from David on this in the notes below, because I realise it's a contentious area and one we need to maybe look at more carefully and challenge some conceptions in the area. So how can you use this information? Well, number one, keep yourself cool. Number two, keep your horse cool. Number three, plan ahead. I know we're limited in equestrian activities because we have to wear boots, pads, protectors. Polo, we play in jeans and sometimes a not very breathable t-shirt. which all increase the rate of heat storage that we experience as an athlete. So it's really important that we maybe put some of these measures in place ahead of playing to make sure that we're as cool as possible when we start playing, so we can maintain that low core temperature for as long as possible, make better decisions, and decrease our risk of heat illness and heat stroke. Same for our horse. It's all just a horse welfare thing. So if we can put some good cooling strategies in place, particularly post-game, and just manage their exposure to different sources of heat, then that's fantastic. If you want to get in touch with me to discuss this further, check me out on Instagram or Twitter, simply Russ Best. And please, if you can, follow Wintec, Centre for Sports Science and Human Performance. We'll have details about a couple of studies we're trying to run in this area soon. Thank you very much for listening.